It's my pleasure to today introduce Dr. Karim Abdel-Motaal, founder of KAM Portfolio Managements and APQ Partners, with a doctorate in economics from Harvard University. Dr. Motaal, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
So the first thing I wanted to touch base upon was how this economic downturn created by the pandemic, whether or not it's going to create a window of opportunity for Biden, and if so, how is he going to be able to re-stimulate the American economy in the short term and the long term?
Crises always offer opportunity in general, certainly in the policy making as well as in the investment arenas, which I understand we'll speak about a bit later. The way I would approach your question is this: the U.S. economy and the United States in general has been in need of long-term investments of various types that have gone unfulfilled as a result of I would argue, an exaggerated concern about fiscal prudence, about not spending too much on the government side and not running very large budget deficits, which I believe the pandemic and the evolution of U.S. politics, I'll elaborate on that in a second, has potentially changed positively for Biden. So the U.S., you may or may not be aware, which is one of the most dynamic, open, liberal economies in the world, has struggled of late, and of late I would say really in the last 30 odd years, in a number of areas quite fundamental to long-term well-being of a society and a nation. The U.S. is in need of massive improvements to its infrastructure. I'm assuming both of you have visited the United States, but when you compare U.S. highways, U.S. railroads, U.S. airports, John F. Kennedy Airport being an obvious one that we all transitioned through, not to mention electricity and wireless infrastructure, internet cables, 5G, mobile telephony, etc. It is woefully inadequate compared not just with Europe, but also many developing nations. I mean, China, South Korea, say significantly superior infrastructure to the one that exists in the United States. Some of that it has to do with state level issues, not federal. So not things that Biden can easily fix. But the federal government has an enormous role in that area. And historically, it's been very difficult to motivate public investment in infrastructure, for example, because of generally Republican objections to deficit spending and spending in general that's not fully funded. But also to a degree, democratic acquiescence to the same concept and fear of running very large budget deficits and running up debt, right?
Yeah.
The health service in the U.S. The U.S. is the only Western developed nation, I believe, the statement is correct, not to have at least basic public health provided either on a means-tested fashion, depending on income, or for free to its population. And that's a problem that's, the consequences of which have, come home to roost vividly in the context of the pandemic. I mean, it's pretty brutal to be suffering COVID-19 when you lack access to basic healthcare, preventative medicine, therapeutic medicine, or in severe cases, hospitalization. Right? Again, the U.S. made an initial stride with Obamacare under the Obama administration. The Democrats were fought tooth and nail by the Republicans in Congress throughout that administration. And the project is incomplete. I mean, there are still, even with Obamacare, I forget the number, but some 20, 30, or 40 million Americans that lack health insurance of any kind, and a significantly larger number than that has that is underinsured. In other words, the health insurance they have is basically for emergencies only, and other than that, they forgo going to the doctor because it's very expensive, right? And that's exhibited in basic well-being statistics, right? I mean, the United States has one of the lowest life expectancies in the OECD, right? It's lower than most countries in Western Europe, right? In fact, life expectancy has been falling over the course of a few years, in the last decade, for example, right? And then, last but not least, all issues related to education, right? Again, the US performs quite poorly on standardized testings in science and math, etc. Again, compared to its OECD counterparts. Again, I don't think that's entirely to do with lack of funding and public investment. I mean, there are other issues, that explain that, but certainly central government attention to that issue has been constrained, right? Sorry, and then last but not least, anything having to do with climate, same problem, right? So why is it an opportunity? The pandemic blew up all fiscal considerations and put them to the wayside, right? So the US economy, the US government, just like most Western governments, correctly implemented massive public sector spending programs to rescue and relieve the suffering of the population at large, unemployment, and and so on, and by extension, the sensitivity of spending large amounts of money, I would argue, has been diminished, and certainly in the U.S. context, because it was a Republican administration under Trump that did the spending, right? So it's very difficult for Republicans to argue Biden shouldn't spend when they spent as much as they did under the Trump administration, right? Additionally, because the pandemic effectively is a contractionary shock, it decelerates the economy and puts downward pressure on growth and inflation, interest rates collapsed last year, right? So the cost of borrowing to fund these programs is the lowest it's been really in a generation, if not ever. It's negative in real terms, in inflation-adjusted terms. So the U.S. government can borrow 30 years out at negative interest rates. In other words, adjusted for inflation, the market is paying to lend the money, right? So if ever there's an argument to borrow and invest, this is it. So the stars are aligned for the Biden administration to seize this opportunity. Right now, there are all sorts of other political hurdles, and we can debate whether they will spend on the right things or the wrong things, and and all of that good stuff. And there are always some positive incentives and some negative ones, but there's certainly an opportunity for some historic long-term investment to be done across, I would argue, the central areas that define the long-term well-being of the society and an economy, which are health, education, infrastructure, and increasingly climate change.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add on to that. In the last 4 years of the Trump administration, it seems now that there's sort of craving in America for any type of stability or future idea to push towards. So I think because obviously there's a lot of stigma against Joe Biden as well as Trump. So it'll be interesting to see how he responds to that opportunity.
Agreed entirely.
And more specifically, I mean, with the announcement a few weeks ago that Biden was able to secure the Senate after the runoff elections in Georgia, now that he has this huge mandate with which to enact policy, how do you kind of see him achieving these economic goals? Is it through more like demand side policies, or is he going to raise taxes on corporations? What kind of do you envision?
Sure. So my suspicion is the Democrats will do what the Democrats and effectively left-wing or left of center parties always do. And it is exactly, as you correctly put it, demand side policy. So they're planning to spend, right? I am not very optimistic on supply side microeconomic policies, be they tax rationalization, let alone tax reduction, or other sort of regulatory, positive policies. It's not impossible that they do them, but that's not the natural program of a democratic administration. I think they're going to press the pedal on the spending side. Under normal circumstances, you would worry a little bit about that. In other words, if you're going to spend, you don't want to raise taxes dramatically. You don't want you want to worry about incentives, how you're going to fund the spending, and so on. But in this particular case, again, because rates are zero in nominal, interest rates are zero in nominal terms, negative in real inflation-adjusted terms. If ever there was a time to take risk with a left-wing government spending program, this is it. I mean, what's the worst that could happen, right? I mean, it costs nothing to fund these programs, right? The worst that could happen is they don't work because they're spending only. So, to give you an example, if all you do on US education, for example, which is flailing, is to just throw money at it, it might not work, right? The problem might be, that the quality of school teachers or school unions, or the absence of voucher programs and choice, and an ability of, parents to move their kids from one good school to a bad school, from one bad school rather to a good school, etc. Right? But if ever there was a time to take risk with just spending, throwing money at a problem, I would argue this is it. So that's my impression. Could be wrong. That's not the optimal policy. I mean, an optimal policy program addressing these issues would, exactly as you point out, not be exclusively focused on the demand side. But my impression is that's the direction they're going to go.
And of the many controversial topics that they've been discussing with the Trump and Biden election, one of them was China, and seeing how China's emerged from this pandemic even stronger economically than ever, very unexpectedly. Do you think that Biden's going to continue in Trump's tariff and restriction plan, or do you think he's going to be more globalist and accepting with trade in China?
So I'm afraid he's now boxed in, and here, I'm an economist by training, so I'm going, a little bit outside of my own realm of expertise into, political prognostication. But my impression is he's boxed in now by what Trump did, and by the general adverse perception of China and everything China related, for some arguably correct reasons, namely, what China's been doing on the IP theft side and unfair competition side, etc., for decades. That there, the Biden administration will find itself really boxed in an ability to wean itself off of the highly confrontational, and I would argue self-destructive, tariff policies of the Trump administration. Huh? My impression is that Biden will try and de-escalate and try and find a more constructive way to manage the quote-unquote China problem. And I would define the problem as fundamentally one of lack of intellectual property right enforcement in China, theft of intellectual property, of Western and U.S. intellectual property by the Chinese, willy-nilly, unfair competition, particularly for U.S. entrants and Western entrants into the Chinese market. You're probably familiar with the the various anecdotes for a Western company to be competitive in China. They basically need to partner up with a Chinese company. And the minute the Chinese company masters the original technology, the Western partner is, chucked by the wayside, and they run with it, kind of thing, right? Yeah. Which obviously is problematic and needs to change. My suspicion is the Biden administration will try and manage that more constructively, less confrontationally, and less bluntly than the way Trump did. But unfortunately, tariffs, which are a way of shooting yourself in the foot, unfortunately, but that's what the U.S. has done, are in full keeping with what the Democratic political leanings are, right? So I don't see a very strong incentive, if you think of sort of a Bernie Sanders or Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez kind of a wing of the Democratic Party in the US, even before Trump, they would have been in favor of tariffs on China, right? So my suspicion is we're going to live with that for a while, right? I think the policy is stupid. I don't think it does anything to correct the legitimate critiques of what China is doing. And to the degree it does anything at all, it does it at maximal expense to the US itself, right? But I think we're going to be living with that for a while, but within the context of an attempt to manage the China relationship in a more constructive direction, if only less confrontational direction than under the Trump administration.
And how will, in a time where more kind of cohesion is needed between parties, how do you think Biden will sort of simultaneously satisfy ideas by the extreme left, by AOC, by Bernie, and by then the extreme right, like the Trump Republicans? How will they do this simultaneously, or will he have to kind of cede on one aspect of his policy?
So the question you're asking is the probably in my opinion the most difficult part of the political economy of the U.S. today, and what Biden faces, right? So Biden by nature, I think, is centrist. He is a politician who's been doing politics in the U.S. for half a century in some form or other. He has wide contacts across the entire political spectrum on both sides of the aisle, Democratic and Republican. I think his instincts are to compromise, find middle ground, and to push through a bipartisan type agenda. Mm-hmm. However, his success in doing that depends, unfortunately, on both sides of the extreme of the spectrum that you just described, namely the right wing of the Republican Party and the extreme left wing of the Democratic Party, by which I mean the following, right? So he's being pulled in two directions. The right wing of the of U.S. politics, represented by sort of Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, and in Congress, McCarthy and Steve Scalise, etc., are continue to play to and pander to Trump's core base. Yeah. And these guys really want very little in the way of compromise with the Democrats, and would rather do everything in their power to obstruct and make Biden a one-term president, in the same manner as their antecedents did with Obama, right? On the other side of the spectrum, I mentioned them before, Bernie Sanders, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and that crew, their general outlook, as best as I can discern it, is we've tried compromise with the Republicans under Obama. They obstructed him for 8 years. They ensured that the Obama recovery following the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009 was weaker than it would have been, because they prevented the size of the rescue program and other policies that would have given you a more robust recovery. And they gave us Trump, and a compromise with them is futile. And we should just plow full speed ahead, implementing our agenda, ignore the Republicans, do what we need to do, and move on. And that is the way to ensuring we win the next election and not be held hostage by them again. So these are the two sides of the spectrum, right? Unfortunately for Biden, both sides can cause the other one to win, meaning the Republicans acting very obstructionist out of the gate could play into the hands of the left wing of the Democratic Party and the pressure they can put on Biden. And you already see it now. I don't know to what degree you guys are following, but there's an ongoing debate as we speak on how to organize the Senate, given it's 50-50 senators of both parties, and the whole issue of the filibuster being the rule that allows the minority party to obstruct the majority party because you would need 60 senators to pass legislation instead of just 51, right? Yeah. And Mitch McConnell, the I guess now minority leader, the Republican minority leader in the Senate, 2 weeks ago he was the majority leader, is asking for acquiescence by the Democrats to maintaining the filibuster 60-vote rule in order for him to agree on the basic organizational principles of the 50-50 Senate. Overplaying hands like that feed into Bernie Sanders and AOC's of the world on the Democratic side and just argue their case that the Republicans are going to be obstructionists and we should just jettison any attempt to compromise with them and go our own way, right? Similarly, the other side, right? If assuming the Republicans want to play ball, if all the legislation the Democrats put on the table are extreme left-wing ones, spend on this, spend on that, bail out this, bail out that, socialist program X, socialist program Y, that makes the Republicans also less willing to compromise. So Biden has his work cut out for him, right? And I don't know really. I mean, if recent history is any guide, I would forecast he fails because the U.S. is so polarized, right? But he wants to try, and certainly it's going to be challenging. He has his work cut out for him.
And obviously, since you run a hedge fund, I think this question will probably be a bit more personal to you. Now, with his proposed policy program and everything coming out, what do you think will be the investment implications in your world to say?
Sure. So opportunities and risks, right? So the opportunities are reasonably obvious. So under a Democratic administration, pedal to the metal, spend, further kind of program, assets that did not benefit from the technology-led recovery of last year are now poised to benefit. So we call them in sort of investment speak, cyclical type investments, be they stocks or bonds or currencies or countries that that benefit from a more broad-based recovery that you can have if the Democrats spend on everything. So a recovery that is not simply focused on the major technology names like Apple, Google, Facebook, and so on. Right? So that's one investment implication. So all sorts of run-of-the-mill stocks, for example, of companies like auto companies, consumer companies, etc., could do well under a broad-based recovery. My other pet theme, and one near and dear to my heart, is climate. I mean, the Biden administration and the left in the US in general are very, very focused on climate change. Biden has just rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. There are all sorts of investments of an infrastructure nature in renewable energy, carbon mitigation, and things like that. There's a whole sector that has already benefited somewhat last year, but I would argue stands to benefit significantly more over the next couple of years from public sector support in the US and elsewhere in that area. So these would be the two kind of broad thematic areas of return generation that I think could benefit from a Biden administration. On the risk side, it relates to what we were discussing earlier, which is in a world where interest rates are at or near zero, the Federal Reserve and central banks are printing money, and governments are spending like there's no tomorrow, that's a tide that lifts all assets, good assets and bad assets. And if you look at how the stock market, take an example, the bond market not very different from that either. Everything is going up in price terms on the equity side, going down in yield or spread terms on the bond side, meaning companies can borrow at lower and lower rates independent of their credit quality and the nature of their business and whether they're successful or not. That poses a risk, obviously, in that the bad will go up with the good, and at some point there will be a pay the piper time, and the bad assets that have gone up when they shouldn't have in price will suffer. So that's the risk.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought up the climate change, because for me, anyways, seeing the election as one of the biggest factors, I think what should be one of the biggest voting factors for Americans, because I think it's one of the problems in America that can't be fixed after the 4-year administration. It's really something that needs to act now. And I wanted to get your perspective on perhaps implementing a carbon price in the US and countries around the world, and how that would work. Because I think, especially in a capitalist country like America, I really don't see much help coming this way unless there's an economic incentive.
Again, excellent question. I agree with you entirely. Carbon pricing and price-based mechanisms are obviously exactly what an economist or an economic textbook will tell you you need to do, at least as a starting point, if not as as part of a climate-related public policy. Carbon pricing has had enormous promise when it first came online. And for a variety of reasons, it was never taken to its logical conclusion. And I would argue has underperformed its potential. I mean, we should be getting way better results in changing behavior of corporations and individuals, right, than we have to date using carbon pricing and price-based policies. And I think a major reason, I would argue, and this is my opinion, there are two reasons for that. The first is they were incompletely implemented and not sufficiently generalized, right? I mean, the simplest of carbon prices, to give you an example, the United States, which is the biggest polluter on Earth and the biggest consumer of oil and gas, is the only Western nation that does not have a gas tax, a gas on petrol. I mean, you're probably aware, but here in the UK, I don't know what the number is, but well over 50% of the price we pay at the pump for petrol is tax, right?
Yeah.
In the US, that tax is zero, nothing, right? I mean, imagine the impact on carbon reduction, the environment, the US and the world, if the US were to implement a carbon tax, right? A gas tax, right? And you might have noted in the pretty spectacular $1.9 trillion spending economic program, if you will, that the Biden administration has just released. It does not include such a tax, even though it's like obvious, right? Yeah. That it's something like that is probably the lowest hanging fruit, right? And that's because there is enormous political aversion. If you followed the Yellow Vest protests in France, which were in fact the result of an attempt to raise an already high, gas tax in France. In the US, it's politically toxic, something like that. Right? But so I don't know how the politics will work. The politics are the impediment, but certainly that is what the doctor ordered, right? But then there are other things that are less politically problematic, and I would argue they're less effective for the reason that you alluded to. But subsidies, right? If taxation is always problematic, right? But in an environment of again negative real interest rates, subsidizing consumer and corporate behavior, be it new technologies, be it adoption of for example, electric cars, solar panels, etc. There is an enormous amount that could be done in that department.
Mm-hmm. And just a bit now back onto the investment opportunities. I mean, throughout the pandemic, we saw maybe perhaps in response to the failing of the bond market, we saw a greater investment into the stock market, despite many businesses which were having investment in them, perhaps not doing so well. How do you see this as an investment opportunity going forward, or has a time kind of passed now that the pandemic is slowly getting better?
Well, it's certainly not as attractive, and I mean, it may sound like a strange thing to say, but and as easy to make money as it was after the massive sell-off in asset prices in March, April of last year. So I don't think it's over, but it's certainly different, right? The nature of the investment opportunity has changed. It's gone from assets are so cheap, I'm going to close my eyes, ignore the pandemic-related risks, and just buy them, and reap the rewards when we all discover that the pandemic is solvable with vaccines and other public health mitigation measures, etc. It's shifted from that was the investment case last year, to a case of vaccines are now coming online, governments are still spending, interest rates are still very low, and monetary policy is very loose as implemented by central banks the world over, and there is a big economic rebound coming online as we and you and your generation, when the weather gets nicer, go out and party and start traveling and buying and doing all the things that the sort of pent-up demand that we all forewent last year and now as a result of the pandemic. So the case has changed, but there's still that kind of opportunity. However, I would still caution, as I alluded to earlier in response to your question, everything is going up. I'm sure you followed. Bitcoin is going up 10 and 20% a day. Tesla, the electric car manufacturer, has gone from 100 to 800, 900, in the span of 9 months. Some of this stuff is too crazy, too frothy, and will at some point correct and rationalize. And so you have to be more discriminating in what it is that you're buying in this environment compared to 6 or 8 months ago.
Just for the last question, I know you mentioned earlier about the 1.9 trillion stimulus plan. I just wanted to get your opinion on, now that US public debt is at historic peacetime levels, do you think that the Biden administration can afford to borrow and spend? And if so, what are its limitations?
Yes. So my opinion on this is an unambiguous yes. And it's for the reason that I alluded to earlier. When interest rates are this low, the market is begging you to take their money and invest it for them, because they are either afraid to invest it themselves or don't know where to put it. Right? That's basically what it means to have nominal interest rates at zero and negative interest rates, and real interest rates negative. Yeah. And not just in the US, by the way, it's even more the case in Europe and in Japan, right? And if you put yourself in the shoes of a public policymaker, sort of, the U.S. government, as an example, if investors and the market is willing to give you their money for 30 years at minus, let's call it 20, 30 basis points, 0.2 to 0.3% in real terms, in inflation-adjusted terms, for you to not take it is a pretty extraordinary statement, right? It means that you as a government cannot think of a single socially viable investment to make with people's money that exceeds a rate of return greater than minus 0.2%. It's a crazy statement. I mean, frankly, just investing in putting up schools in poor neighborhoods will certainly have a social rate of return higher than that, right? Just as an off-the-cuff example. So I think this is a historic time to borrow and spend. I don't think there's any constraint in the level of public debt or any sort of borrowing constraint that governments face at the moment. That also poses a challenge in that it can certainly make them borrow and spend on stupid things, right? Yeah. Because they have no discipline and no constraint. But assuming they borrow and spend on the right stuff, I think it's an enormous opportunity, and I don't think that the level of public debt is any constraint at the moment, or that there are any borrowing constraints to worry about, really, for generally well-run governments in economies with well-functioning central banks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it seems to be that Biden's got his work cut out for him. So, Mr. Motaal, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for taking the time to do this interview. It's been very informative, and I'm sure our readers are going to love it, especially in such turbulent times.